190 magazines. Our digital archive consists of all past and current issues, an encyclopedia to inspire and inform our audience. For over 78 years, Marg has been publishing its quarterly art magazine, and while we get excited about every magazine that is conceptualized, created, and produced by the foundation, this volume has walked a different path, one of many Margs. The History of Indian Perfume is essential reading for perfumers, chefs, historians, visual arts, and really anyone who wants to know why we experience the world through smell and how we develop our smellscapes, olfactory landscapes. Specifically, who made these scents? Why did they make them? How did they travel? Who are they made for? Who uses them? All these and many more questions will be discussed by our panelists this evening. Our panelists are Professor James McHugh, our guest editor of this volume. James is Professor of South Asian Religions at the University of Southern California. He's also probably the very first graduate student to officially attach an archive sense as part of his PhD thesis on perfume making in ancient India. Geeti Dutt, PhD scholar in anthropology at the Australian National University in Canberra. She's currently conducting fieldwork on the life cycle of Indian attars. Geeti is also a perfumer who has been using and mixing attars for over a decade, and she also is going to launch her own brand. Professor Saman Habib will be moderating the conversation today. She's a scientist at the CSIR Central Drug Research Institute, Lucknow, where she works on parasitic diseases. She is interested in the documentation of oral history and culture and also performs dramatized readings. At Marg, we are a small but dedicated team providing a platform for our many intellectually rich scholars, craftspeople, artists, and photographers. We endeavor to take their work to the highest academic levels and institutions the world over, and we cannot do this without the kind of help and support we receive from our sponsors. A big thank you to the Harish and Beena Shah Foundation for supporting the Marg Foundation, our magazine sponsors BNP Paribas, TVS Motor Company, Pirojsha Godrej Foundation. A special thanks to Madhavi Kukreja for putting this evening together, and the team at Sanat Kara Foundation and the Lucknow Bioscope, and our venue partner, Hotel Saraca Lucknow, for hosting this fragrant discussion in this beautiful courtyard. I'd now like to invite the panelists to begin by launching the magazine, and may I also invite Mr. Abhishek Mishra, the General Manager, Saraca Lucknow. Please, if you all could come. I'd now like to invite Professor James McHugh to start the evening.
Okay, can you hear me now? Is that okay? Can you hear me okay? Maybe I'll stand, in fact. If that doesn't, I'll stay within sight of the camera. Yeah, so thank you, Al Mitra, for that introduction, and actually all your work with organising these events and the publicity. We had a beautiful event yesterday in Delhi as well. So more thanks here. And I really want to thank everyone at Marg. They've done such a beautiful job, amazing to work with. Naman Ahuja, who invited me to do this guest editing, and all the editors and designers. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, academics writing is often terrible and unreadable and boring and dry, but the editors are so good at, like, you know, pushing back and going, that is just too boring, you've got to, like, rewrite that. No one knows what that word means. So they did such a good job. Of course, all the contributors, and for the more ethnographic pieces, the informants as well. And especially the various sponsors. Thank you, this beautiful Saraca Hotel, amazing place, the audience, and this Bioscope Lucknow, which is a fascinating thing. I mean, I'm really pleased I've got time to have a few more days in Lucknow and sort of learn more about the culture and things. And this organisation is doing exactly what somebody like me needs to learn. So thank you. Yes, so I thought I'd talk a little bit today. I'm going to go over my research in perfumery a bit, which actually isn't in the magazine so much, but like my background to what I learned when I wrote this book quite a long time ago, about over 10 years ago, about perfumes and smells in ancient India. And then I'm going to talk about the Marg, the magazine, if you think with smell was the basic idea, you know, where do we even go with that? So how we decided to do what we did and what wonderful things we got, and they're great. And then a few reflections on maybe where we can go in the future. So yeah, how I ended up doing this. I'm this person from Leeds, just was doing a degree in philosophy, very boring, dry, analytic Anglo-American philosophy as an undergrad, and it is good, but it's a bit dry, and so while I was doing that, I took a class on Buddhism, just out of curiosity. I knew nothing about it, and what happened is the person teaching that was a Sanskrit professor, and he was talking about all these different, mostly Indian Buddhist philosophies, and all these varied, you know, different ones like Madhyamaka, Sautrantika, and things like that. And I was like, no one told me about this. This is amazing. And actually, I didn't even really know anything about Sanskrit or sort of Indian intellectual history. I knew nothing about it. And so I started hanging around with this professor and taking classes with him and got more and more into it. But then I felt like there was a gap in a way, because I was really interested and impressed by that stuff. But to a certain extent, there was a sort of disconnect between these intro to Buddhism books that you'd get, say, in England in the 90s and the 80s, and they'd all be philosophy and meditation, and there's one quite famous book that I was told to read, and I was quite interested in things like temples and flowers and garlands and statues, and this book had this little, after going into lots of meditation and lots of philosophy, it had this little one throwaway line of like, and of course, you know, sort of, some superstitious people think we need garlands and statues, but we don't. And I was like really not satisfied with that in studying any of these religions. I was like, come on, that's really weird, and like we need to understand this more. And in particular, I was interested in smells and sort of potions and things like that. And actually really what got me going with the smell project is I was doing a class on Buddhist monasteries. And so you have these Vinaya texts from ancient India, in languages like Pali. You have them in Sanskrit as well, in fact. And they sort of spell out the laws of these ancient Buddhist monasteries, what you can and can't do, what you've got to do. And they cover all sorts of things, and they're very detailed. And so you can learn about all sorts of things, you know, razors, toothsticks, all sorts of things. And so I was writing a paper on that, and I particularly got interested in the sort of adornments of the body, or the lack of, that, you know, Buddhist monks and nuns couldn't have beautiful hair oils because they were shaving their heads, and they couldn't have lots of garlands and perfumes. And so I was reading about that, but I realized that in a way, these prohibitions made no sense unless you kind of understood why anyone would be doing that in the first place. And actually, at one point, I was reading about the various thing, you know, it's like Buddhist monks can't wear garlands, they can't use various unguents and stuff. And I was like, well, that's kind of like my lifestyle. I don't wear garlands, I don't smear unguents on my body. So, you know, it wouldn't be much of a hardship. And I had a shaved head at that point, basically. So it was like, wouldn't be much of a hardship for me to be adopt these regulations with regard to things like perfumes. But obviously, you know, 2,000 or so years ago, it meant something. So that led me on this path to understand what these things were that these Buddhist monks and nuns were not allowed to do. And so I started looking into that. And then actually at this point, I discovered the scholarship of this amazing Indian scholar who I'm sort of going to digress on a little bit. Some of you might know, called P.K. Gode. He was in Pune at the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute, like G-O-D-E, Gode. And he wrote these amazing, many papers, and they came out in volumes on Indian cultural history and Indian literary history. They're the most interesting books ever written. They cover all sorts of topics. So, and he had actually discovered in that archive, because he was the sort of head archivist, he discovered these actual Sanskrit texts that were like just loads and loads of perfume recipes, like pages and pages of perfume recipes. Unclear exactly how old they are, maybe 800 years old, maybe a bit not quite as old. It's hard to date these texts sometimes. So he'd written about those, and so I got really fascinated with all that, and I was like, you know, I'm gonna try and study this a bit more, see what else we can find. So I started looking into that. The thing is, there's a lot, as quite a lot of you I'm sure know, when you're dealing with ancient texts, there's a lot of limitations you run into. Sometimes the ancient text is used and read for like centuries, and you know what it means to people will change over time, obviously. And then say with literary texts, it's often very stylized, it doesn't necessarily reflect a social reality. You can't necessarily read about some very poetic description of people using perfumes and in some sort of erotic context and assume that's what people actually did. So you have to sort of, you know, take things with a pinch of salt. And then there's regional variation. So you might have a medical text mentioning some herbs, and the way that herb is understood, you know, say in Kashmir from Tamil Nadu varies as well. So there's a lot of difficulties with this, but you know, I sort of try to do the best I can and do a wide-ranging study of everything from how people understood the sense of smell. The sense of smell, the way they understood the sense of smell in philosophical texts, is kind of interesting. It's kind of hard. It's somewhere between like something like touch, where you kind of have contact with an item, and then if you think with vision, you don't have contact with something. Like I see those flowers, but you know, I don't have contact. But with smell, the way they understood smell is particles from the fragrant item leave and they get carried by the wind, which is why the wind is often called in Indian languages, it has a synonym of the odor carrier, like Gandhavaha. And so the particles then touch my nose, and then I experience the odor. So it's kind of interesting, because it's like you do actually have contact, physical contact with the odor, but it's at a distance. So it's kind of somewhere between touch, and you can feel the wind as well. And there's a lot of stuff in poetry about, oh, I can feel the perfumed wind that came from the south and went past the body of my absent lover, and things like that. So yeah, there were all sorts of aspects I looked into. That's how people thought smell worked. But I'm just going to sort of throw out a few of the things I discovered that are kind of worth noting. But one thing I wanted to do as well is emphasize the sort of, and this is probably an elite minority and all that kind of stuff, but emphasize the kind of intellectual tradition within the Indian texts, rather than superimposing sort of, you know, a modern European framework on it all. So one thing that comes up when I talk about smell a lot, say with my students, is smell and memory. This idea of smell, evoking memories, which I'm sure is a very real thing that people actually really experience, but it's only really been emphasized strongly in sort of relatively recent. That emphasis appeared in Europe a few centuries ago and has, you know, mushroomed, as it were. But they don't really emphasize that at all in the ancient Indian texts. What smell does in ancient India, in literary texts and many other contexts, is the smell comes from over there to over here, and I go, oh wow, that's beautiful. It's changed my mood. It's made me happy and maybe full of desire, but not desire for these little molecules or particles that are in my nose. It's made me full of desire for the thing that has the smell. So it makes you go to it like a bee to a flower, this classic image of a bee to a flower. And this actually unites people often. So rather than connecting people in time, like memory, it connects people in space. Like in the famous episode in the Mahabharata where Matsya Gandhi sort of smells a fish, and then she kind of gets a wish and she goes, well, I want to smell really nice, I don't want to smell a fish anymore. And so she smells amazing, you can smell her for miles. She's got the most amazing perfume ever. And that leads to an encounter which has big repercussions for epic history. So that's one thing that I discovered. Another thing is even in the absence of any marketing or advertising or anything, these medieval, however we define that and however all these texts are, quite a lot of the perfumes have really evocative names. There's quite a few that are named after types of, there's not just one Sanskrit word for an arrow, like a bow and arrow. It's like they had a lot of bows and arrows, so they had lots of different words for them. So there's some that are just named after types of arrow, which would be Kamadeva's arrows. Sort of like, if you wear this, you're like, it's going to go straight to their heart. Another one is Kolahala, which is sort of chaos. And so if you wear this incense, or burn it in a room, it's just going to turn into a frenzy of erotic excitement. And then my favorite one is this incense about which it says, if you burn this incense and a man fumigates his clothes with it and then wears these clothes and walks around town, everyone's going to go, Kogachati, like, who goes there? Who's that? Who was that person that walked past? Who walks by? So, which is kind of almost tacky, you know what I mean? It's almost like a sort of cheap 1970s advert, you know what I mean? But I think that's really amazing. It's like there's no advertising, and they have these kind of really playful, fun names. There's more, but I'll stop with those. Another thing is, in terms of gender, they really weren't gendered, the perfumes. I always mention how when I'm teaching, sometimes we've got smells here tonight, so when I'm teaching about smell in America, I used to hand around like a perfume thing and kind of go, let's think about it, and things like that, like you do, and try to keep the students' attention, and things like that. And what would happen is you'd be talking to a load of 18-year-old Americans, 20-year-old Americans, and less so now, in fact, it's changed, but 10 years ago, all the female students would smell it, and a lot of the male students would just sort of hold it away and go, oh, I don't want to smell a flower. I'm too manly to be seen. They were ashamed to be seen putting a flower to their nose. So it's so hyper-gendered, but you don't have that. Actually, the man wearing flowers and holding a flower on the cover of Mark amply demonstrates that. Another thing is there were many different, they didn't have itters in this very ancient period. They had many other formats and preparations. And it kind of varied from the time of the day. You'd start out with fragrant sort of body scrub, sort of clays, and then you'd have a fragrant water, and you'd maybe have a fragrant massage with fragrant oil, and then you'd put on fragrant things like sandal paste, but mixed pastes. You'd wear a garland, you'd use mouth perfume, your clothes would have been fumigated with incense. And this all had to match as well. So there's one really fabulous story where there's complicated reasons. There's a guy basically trying to fake that he's a really good perfumer to kind of get in with some people to achieve a political thing. But he isn't really a perfumer, but he's got to convince this prince that he is a perfumer. So what the prince does is the prince is suspicious that it's like, oh, this guy, I don't know if this guy really is a perfumer, maybe he's trying to trick me. So the prince is wearing a garland, and he burns some incense for this guy, the sort of fake perfumer, but he's actually a really clever fake perfumer. So the clever perfumer, as soon as he burns this incense, kind of like hits his head and goes, "Oh my God, I've got a migraine, this is disgusting, I can't handle it." And the prince is like, "What's wrong, what's wrong?" And he goes, "Oh, that's the most terrible combination. You cannot have that incense with that garland." And so you can see that, you didn't just wear one thing, you like spray on one thing. You had to have this whole wardrobe of different things, which was sometimes connected with different times of day, like the morning and the evening, and they all had to match. And of course, as with It Is the Day, they had to match the season and things like that. And they were often very visual as well. And this is a thing that came up with the Marg, is, how do we have a visual magazine of smells? And one sort of solution to that can be found in the philosophical materials, but also in the practice, is that the theory of odors is that to have an odor, like a flower, has to contain the element earth, and the element earth has all the sensory properties. So if something contains earth particles in sort of Hindu philosophies, I'm simplifying here, it will also be visible, tangible, audible, and whatever the other sense is, I can't remember. But that means that actually things like perfumes are going to be visible, tangible. So your sandalwood paste is cool. If it's got saffron in, it's bright yellow, and so on and so forth. So actually, like you can see those flowers, they were often very visible. And I was saying to someone earlier as well, like, you don't get this quite so much, and itters are somewhat visible, so they smear them on clothes. But a really good example of the sort of, perhaps one of the most famous visible perfumes in the world is the Naman on Venkateshwara's forehead, which is a huge slab of Borneol camphor that they replace every Friday, and they sort of mold, and it's a massive piece of hyper-fragrant camphor on that forehead. So that is actually, it's cooling, because camphor is cooling to the skin, and it's visual and bright white, but it's also super perfume. So these things were visible. So there's some findings I had. Let's see, so I'll talk about the Marg a bit now. How are we doing for time? When did I start? Sorry. 5 minutes, yeah. Okay, so I'll talk a bit about the Marg. So, like I said, they approached me and we wanted to do something on smell, vaguely. And I was like, well, where do you even begin with that? So we decided to narrow it down, partly because of what I know about and what I'm able to sort of help editing and things, is to go with sort of historical things, with some ethnographic things, and also with perfume and perfumery. So within that, I tried to invite as many sort of young, new scholars as possible, sort of with fresh ideas and approaches. I really in a way, I wanted to get away from everything I just talked about and do new material. And I also, there's some really good articles and beautiful materials on, say, rose distillation at Kanoj and things like that, with beautiful photographs and things. But, people have done that before, so I wanted, even when we do things like itters, I wanted to have new materials. So I'll sort of briefly go over some of the materials that came in. So we have one of the first early articles is Ahalya Matan, and she did this really nice study. We've got these really good illustrations of garlands knotting and the sort of skills involved in tying South Indian garlands, and even making these kind of complicated, the garland makers can make these parrots as well, and all these very elaborate things. And we've got a really good illustrator to do these amazing images of the hands doing the knots. So that's a really original piece, because I've seen people making garlands and I've always been like, how exactly do you do that? And she gets into all the things about like the type, the state. It's very specific. It's like the bud has to be in a very specific state when you pick it, too early or too late, and it won't be a good garland later on. So that's a nice piece. Then Emma Flatt, she's a fabulous scholar of sort of Indo-Islamic materials. She talks about incense and these sort of astrological and magic incenses from the early modern Deccan, and we've got like beautiful art to go with that as well. Fascinating stuff, and she translated some recipes. Neha Vermani, she did a beautiful thing, and this fits in with the multisensory thing I mentioned. She talks about the scents used in Mughal dining. And I've heard that Lucknow is famous for the use of, kewara and other beautiful, fragrant things in your dining, which I'm excited to experience. But yeah, very much the multi-sensory thing. I mean, remember and this applies to medieval Europe as well, the distinction between spice, medicine, and perfume wasn't there. These things can be used for all sorts of things. Same in medieval Europe as well. And then we've got two pieces by Nicholas Roth, who is a scholar of what he does, Sanskrit and Persian and Urdu and early forms of Hindi. But he's this amazing genius at knowing flowers and plants. So he can basically look at any Rajasthani miniature, Mughal miniature, and he can just identify every plant. And even if it's like a narcissus or a rose, he can sort of say which type of narcissus it is. And he sort of tracked down the old varieties. But he doesn't just do that. He then sort of does a deep reading, going, well, that narcissus became fashionable at this point, and it has these implications, which may be gendered or social or seasonal. And so he could do this really rich reading. So he did a nice piece on Champaka and on the sort of little mini history of the rose in India. Shireen Hamza did a really interesting piece on very methodologically experimental. Almitra mentioned sort of recreating these things. And she was trying to recreate these perfume travel sickness lozenges from the Indian Ocean. And so she talks a lot about the benefits and difficulties of recreating ancient recipes. Projit Mukherjee, who was here in Delhi last night, he talks about this fascinating company, the first Indian incense company in America, this Ganesh incense they made, that was run by Lithuanian Jews in Chicago and was very successful and sort of introduced, it's called fragrant Orientalism, all this really interesting imagery. He collects all these labels, so really fascinating piece about the sort of how Americans were introduced to the concept of Indian incense. Then Aditya Harchand, who's just doing a PhD at Chicago in America, he's got all these Tamil pamphlets, these sort of cheap Tamil pamphlets from about 1900, 1910, and some of them have all these recipes for perfumes, snuffs, perfumes, sharbats, home remedies, and yet again, and they're fascinating, and they come with, these pamphlets have really cool little sort of not crude, but sort of simple, old-fashioned little woodcuts and things in them that are amazing. And so he translated some of those for us. Very, very original source material. So it'd be interesting to see what else he finds in these pamphlets, which people haven't looked at so much. And then finally, we're going to talk a bit more about Itar tonight, especially being in Lucknow, near Kannauj and so on and so forth. We have these three great pieces on Itar. I won't talk about Geeti's piece, but Amanda Lancier, she talks about sort of 19th century Itar history and the labor and the owners. And actually some of these owners that sort of owned distilleries, they wrote these little booklets about how to do it. Yet again, why, do we even need, why did they do that? Because I'm sure everyone involved sort of knew how to do it. Why did we need a diagram of a still made by somebody who owns loads of stills, who has loads of employees who deal with stills every day? So she reflects on that. Why were people publishing these things? Great piece, historicizing Itar in a way that's not been done much before ever. And then and one of the speakers from yesterday who can't be here tonight, Malaika Shirazi, she deals with old Delhi Itar shops. Starts with Gulab Singh Joshimar, which is very famous, but talks about others. And what's really interesting with her piece as well is, I've been to that shop and many times. And but what she's really interested in is, they do the great Itars and so on and so forth. But she noticed that actually what a lot of the trade is, the sort of walk-in trade, is people coming in with a perfume they like, maybe a modern, American perfume or something, and they show it to the people that work there, and they sort of do an adaptation, a sort of creative remix, often using synthetics. And this is actually the reality of a lot of the retail Itar trade. I was just in Bhopal asking a few Itar sellers there what the big seller at the moment is, And there, Bhopal, everyone seems to want CR7, the football player Cristiano Ronaldo's. They want a kind of remix of that, this bright blue stuff. And I have to say, I used to be really snooty about that, and used to be like, no, bring out the Asli Itter, I don't want the Ronaldo bright blue synthetic thing. I was a total snob about that. And in a way, Malika's piece sort of points out that, like, yeah, well, maybe that's not your taste, James, and I don't want to denigrate it at all. This is what's happening now. This is what people like. This is part of the reality of modern Indian perfumery. And actually, if you think about it, these people who kind of, you bring something in, they smell it, and like within a short period of time, they can just crank out a copy. That's not a copy, a sort of creative, beautiful remix. That's an incredible skill, you know what I mean? Which, you know, hasn't been admired so much till now. Anyhow, so I think I'm running out of time now, so I'll hold off. I was going to make a few comments about where do we go in future, but I think we're going to have a conversation so we can get into all that. So anyhow, a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the magazine and ancient Indian, medieval Indian perfumes. I'll finish now, and yeah, and we'll, I think, who's next? Yeah, sorry, I'll hand you over, sorry. Saman Habib.
Thank you so much, James. We can have questions now, but perhaps we should wait for our conversation and then we can take questions from the audience, because then Geeti will also be here to answer questions from her discussion. So Geeti, please come join us. We'll begin now. Yes, please. So Adab, and welcome once again on behalf of Sanat Kada Lucknow Bioscope, and welcome James and Geeti from all of us in Lucknow. I'll begin the conversation by making note of something that Professor Naman Ahuja has written in his introduction, his preface to this volume. And he talks of wisdom, he talks of knowledge, and he talks of vidya. And he talks then of Gandh and Sugandh, and he says that these two this knowledge and then the sense of smell are both used in Indian iconography in the form of Vidyadhar and Gandharv as celestial beings, aerial celestial beings who fly, and knowledge and the sense of smell both are able to transform individuals from one realm to the other. So we'll begin a little bit about scientific knowledge on the sense of smell. As you know, there are these 5 major senses, and smell is one of them. And a lot of work in neuropharmacology, neurobiology in the last several decades has focused on understanding how we perceive the complexity of these multitudes of molecules and smell odorants. And it's now clear, the work goes on, but it's clear that it's a very, very complex thing, and that at the nasal epithelium, the mucosa of the nose, you have these multiple receptors, which are called odorant receptors, on the cilia of olfactory neurons. And it is this large number of protein molecules that serve as receptors that actually bind these little small molecules that come from these various sources of smell, and these are small molecules that you call odorants. And these small molecules are very specific, so there's a very specific interaction between the receptor and these molecules, and the intensity of the smell and the diversity and complexity of the smell is a combinatorial effect not only of the interaction itself, but the affinity of the interaction, the number of molecules being excited, the speed at which they are excited, and so on and so forth. So when you perceive smell, this whole chemical signal is transmitted from a chemical to an electrical signal and then goes to your brain. So there's this whole science. It's an extremely intriguing and interesting science. And I think when we talk of synthetics and naturals and the complexity of naturals, I think this is something that we should keep in mind. Now, Geeti, I'll come to you first and then to James. And you are a perfumer, a Gandhi, or a Itrasaz, if I may.
No one's ever said that before.
And so in your experience, in your article you talk of, and some of it was very new to me, is this difference between, of course, jal we understand, there is this jal, then there is ruh, and then there is itra. So technically, can you explain to the audience, I'm sure many of you, of course, know, you are associated with Lucknow, but basically what is the difference between these three? And as a perfumer, how do you sort of decide, and what is the base perfume, what's the base oil, the Indian Editra, then how do you build upon it in various flavors? Because you sort of add different perfumes, different odorants to build a perfume. So how do you do that?
Okay, so Adab, good evening. Thank you for having me here. So to answer your first question, what is a roux, what is a gel, and what is an attar? So there is one method, the Deg Bhabka method, which is probably what a lot of you are familiar with if you've ever seen videos or photographs of Kanauj. And using this same method, you can actually make 3 different things. So gels, this is a hydrodistillation of an aromatic that is a mix of the oil and water. This has the highest yield. So you have gulab gel, kevra gel, any number of gels. So that is one thing. Using the same method, you can also make an attar. Attar mitti, attar gulab, attar shamama, many different attars. And at the basic level, an attar is something that has a base oil. So in the receiver or the bhabka, you will have a base oil. Historically, this used to be sandalwood. These days, people are also using other things because sandalwood is very expensive, it is very hard to acquire. So people are also using DOP and other kinds of things. So you will have a base oil, then you will distill an aromatic onto this base oil. I mean, that's the simplest way to say it, right? So attar gulab would be something like a sandalwood oil with gulab distilled onto it. And then a roux. So roux is the lowest yield and it is the most expensive. Roux is where you just have the pure oil of that aromatic. So again, if we take gulab, you just have the oil of the gulab. So roux gulab would be pure rose oil, attar gulab would be rose distilled onto something else, and then gulab gel would be the water and oil combined. So this is the difference between the 3 things. And to answer your second question, how do you decide what to mix? So to be clear, I'm not a perfumer in a sort of conventional sense, right? So when a lot of us say perfumer, we think of French perfumery, and there is a very specific kind of training that goes into being a French perfumer. But there has globally there's a movement to, you could say, decolonize fragrance, to decolonize perfume, but also to broaden what it means to make perfume. And this is one of the things that I was interested in when I first started buying and using attars. This is almost 10 years ago. I wanted to know, how did Indians or South Asians make perfume? In French perfumery, we all know you have the top, middle, base notes, you have accords, you describe smells, whether they are fruity, floral, woody, all of these things. But as you've already pointed out, James, this is not how Indians talked about smell. This is not what they valued in smell. So I was interested in understanding how South Asians did perfume. And when I was looking for some of these descriptions and guides, actually it was in your PhD dissertation, James, that I found a framework, which is what I use today. So in the Gandhasara, which is from the 1100s or something like that. It's maybe around 1,000 years old. This was a perfumery treatise, from India. There is a description of perfume, and it says that a good perfume is like a well-run kingdom. It has the right mix of allies, neutrals, and enemies, and the perfumer's job is to know what material is what and how to blend them together. And I loved it. So I used that framework to develop my own understanding of how do you identify what is an ally, what is a neutral, what is an enemy, and how do you combine them to make a perfume kingdom. And what is fun about this framework is that, unlike the idea of top, middle, and base notes, where a material will be fixed, it will either be a top note, it will be a base note, it will be a middle note. With this framework, something that is an ally in one perfume might actually be an enemy in a different perfume. So I use that. I've actually developed a method using that framework to make perfumes. Yeah.
Thanks, Didi. James, we touched a little bit on history, right? And so I'll take that forward with you as a historian. You've in this book, in the issue, there are articles, and your article on sources, historical sources, and in Buddhist and Jain inscriptions and the Jatak stories and so on. And then there is this whole section on medieval, Idris and stuff. So if you look at it historically, in India, from ancient, medieval, pre-modern times, how do you see this transition? Are new flavors in perfumes coming in? What are these new flavors? Where are they coming from? Is there a change in the technique? How old is our Deg Bhabka technique really that you consist today? And from where do you start getting the first indications that this is the method used, this is the technology adopted? So some of that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, actually, one thing that really struck me, especially with perfume, I mean, a bit with medicine, but it's really striking with perfume, is how it's really important not to think, oh, there's sort of traditional ancient perfume, sort of like sandalwood paste, and then maybe later on itters, because that's not how it goes, in fact. So if you look at very, very ancient texts, if you look at Vedic texts, they talk about garlands, they talk about gugulu, incense, and then a bit later, sort of slightly later Sanskrit texts, they'll talk about sandalwood and agar wood. And Gugulu's still around, but actually at that point, if you look at sort of like critical editions of things like the epics, you won't have musk, you won't have camphor. So basically, it's more or less around the Gupta period, you get this kind of classic set of perfumes that lingers, especially in things like poetry and perfumery books, which is sort of sandalwood, agarwood. So I have to recite it like the alphabet for me. Sandalwood, agarwood, camphor, musk, and saffron. And it's interesting because they are all presented as somewhat exotic imports. Even sandalwood is seen as sometimes coming from islands or very, very remote southern regions, which seem like incredibly out of the way. But musk is seen as coming from abroad, camphor is seen as coming very expensive. The original camphor from far away. And so that develops. So that's not the end of it. You've got muscapes and things then, but then it's about 1,000 years ago, this is something I did later in research, is civet. I'm sure if you live in India, you know civets. The small Indian civet secretes this stuff, civet, musk. And the civet appears about 1,000 years ago, and it becomes all the rage. It becomes really huge. And what's interesting about civet, actually from a sort of historical point of view, is, civet becomes huge in India, and becomes big in Europe, it becomes big in the Middle East. And what's weird is it's not like something like tobacco, say, wasn't in South Asia, so it appears. Everyone's like, "Whoa, this is amazing! Let's start using this." Civet was kind of there all the time. Civet was there in Java all the time. Civet was there in Ethiopia all the time. Arabs could have had a civet, just over the border in Ethiopia. But suddenly, about 1,000 years ago, it becomes massive, and then before you know it, Shakespeare's talking about civet, and it's like the biggest thing. And there's civet farms in Amsterdam. So it's always changing. As for when itters appeared, I'm not. Somebody needs to work on exactly when that appears. I'm sure there's good sources on that.
Things like Loban, like Boswellia. I mean, was it there in ancient texts, or is this something that's come from?
Loban's an interesting one. Yeah, one of the common words for sort of Loban type stuff is Turushka, which means sort of Turk. So yet again, that was seen as very much coming from lands to the west, so that was probably sort of like Arabian Peninsula frankincense. It's seen as Turushka doesn't mean Turkey, if you know what I mean. It just means, it's like Mlecha or something. It sort of means people to the west. So very strong awareness of things, sort of exotica around them, and constantly in change. And actually, while there's a load of Kanoj people maybe around. One method they talk about in like the Gandhasara, which I've never got my head around, it's not distillation, but they call it a sara, like an essence. And what they do is they kind of have a big sort of clay sort of sieve type thing full of holes, and they smear it with borax. Don't know why. There's about 200 Sanskrit words for borax for some reason. And then they fill it with flowers and drip the juice out. And I just wonder if this is something that rings any bells with perfumers around here. So I'll just throw that out there. But it's always changing. It's always changing. It's not very open-minded, assimilates new materials. It's not a stable process. Yeah.
Are there any treatises or descriptions of the methods, like you mentioned one earlier in your talk, but where you can actually follow in some sense, how is this technology evolving or changing, or what new methods are being introduced in India?
Yeah. They describe the methods decently. In fact, often these old recipes aren't great for following, but there's various methods, like there's like cooking. There's sort of infusing in oil. They basically had this enfleurage method, which is what they use. I'm sure a lot of you know about enfleurage, but it's a way, some flowers it's easier to extract the perfume by just lying them on an oily medium rather than heating them up, and you get a much, this is how jasmine oil was traditionally made in the south of France. But what they did in India is and they still do this for some hair oils, and it's a very ancient method, is you'd layer them with sesame seeds, jasmine, and then every day you put new jasmine with the sesame, and then when the jasmine reeks of sesame, you crush the sesame. I mean, when the sesame reeks of jasmine, you crush it, and you get this sort of natural oil solvent extraction, in fact, which is an old method. So there's all sorts of descriptions of the methods, in fact, yeah.
So, Geeti, now you've worked extensively on Kannauj in the last 2 years, right? And you've been looking at, in your article and otherwise, you've been looking at various things, including, the labor. So we're moving now from the consumption of Itra to the manufacture of Itra. And so in the manufacturing process, I would like to ask you about who are the people who actually make the Itra, so the labor. The whole process of Deg Bhakka, the traditional process of Deg Bhakka is not a mechanized process. So clearly, how much the heat has to be, what temperatures have to be attained. It cannot get very hot. How do you cool it? When do you cool it? Is there enough steam left and things like that? How do they measure it? And clearly, the people who are working there are, very well versed, are experienced. It's a fine art, right? So how are they in Kannauj or in the industry? Are they looked upon as mere workers? Are they looked upon as craftspeople? If they looked upon as craftspeople, what are their wages like? Some light on the people who manufacture these things.
That's a great question, and this was a big focus for me in my own research because the people who make Attar are also often invisible in the popular narratives we have about Attar. You don't often hear about who they are or what is involved. So actually, I would have to say Amanda's article in this issue is a very good one to read if you are interested in this. Amanda Lanzillo, she's a historian, and she writes about how Attar production changed in the 19th century. So going from being small scale, specialists, it became more of an industry. And if you go to Kannauj today, you can see the remnants of that still. Major businesses all around India, in fact, that I've seen that are either manufacturers or retailers, they came up in the 19th century. So at this time also you had more wage labor involved in actually making the attars. And this is still what you see today, really. It's a really good question. People in the industry that I've come across don't really consider the distillers to be artisans. And the distillers know this. So many have said to me, log humko karigar nahi samjhte. And they are remunerated as laborers. This is true. But if you ask me, I would say they are karigars actually. When you spend time and you watch the skills that they use to, as you say, determine is there enough heat, is there enough steam, is there too much steam? Because there's a lot of pressure that builds up, and you have to manage that. And you don't want too much heat because you can also burn the aromatics. There is a lot to this art, and I would say they are karigars, but not really considered to be karigars. And again, in the popular narratives, there are a lot of stories about how, this is a hereditary profession and people have been doing this for generations and generations. But in reality, a vast majority of the distillers that I have met are not in a hereditary profession at all. The manufacturing business owners, yes, they are. The retailing business owners, yes, they are. But the people doing the labor of distillation, I have not met many who learned it from their own forefathers, actually. And I have not met any who are teaching it to their children. So, and I think this is actually a story I've heard in a lot of other artisanal crafts. I've heard a lot of other people say this.
So if that's the case, and if they are not particular hereditaries, people coming in with their children learning it from them and so on, then what is the Itra labor? Is it a Kannauj labor? Are they for Kannauj, or are they migrating from outside Kannauj to work in the industry? Because then it's like labor from anywhere, like a construction labor kind of,
Yeah.
mobile labor. Is it like that?
I can only talk about what I've come across in my field work, and the people that I've met, they live around Kannauj. So they are local people. They are coming from regions near Kannauj. Many of them may have, they may do a mix of things. So they primarily are distillers, but they may also do some farm work. They may have some land themselves, or they may work for others, but in Kannauj, at least, most of the distillers I have met, they are full-time distillers, and they have been doing it for decades. If you go somewhere like Hussain, so Hussain is where the gulab harvest happens. There you get seasonal distillers. So there you will have people who only do it for 1 month of the year. They may be contract distillers. That's very different. But in Kannauj, most of the people I met had been doing it for decades, and that is what they do.
Oh, thank you. So, moving towards the end of this conversation, and I, just like to ask both of you, you said this in your talk, and Geeti has written this in an article, this whole thing of synthetic itr. And how one of us, if we go to an itr shop and ask for itr, it's perfectly likely that we'll be handed over an artificial itr, and we wouldn't know. Because, this jasmine smell or the bela smell is there because the small molecule, it's there. So how do you distinguish between, how is one able to distinguish between natural itr and synthetic itr? And why do you think we're moving towards synthetic itr? Forget about the combinations, forget about the footballer, combinations, but even in natural flavors, natural aromas, like, motia or whatever, khas or whatever, you have synthetics. So why that? What's the economics of it? And where do we go in the future? So both of you.
Okay, wait, there were a few questions in there. Let me start at, where was the first one again? Yes, so the synthetics. Why are there so many synthetics? Why does this happen? I don't know when it started, and synthetics are not a new thing, actually. That much is for sure. It's not something that's only happened in the last 50 years or something like that. I think, when did synthetics first come into India? In the 1800s? 1900s? Something like that. It's a while, actually. So it's not new. But you're right in the sense that if you go to a shop and you ask for an attar, even if you say, I want something with no compounds, no synthetics, something distilled just from the flower or the spice or whatever, yes, it's very likely you will be shown a synthetic. That has been my experience all over India. I have known the difference is through experience, which is, I know, very unhelpful to anybody who wants to know how to tell the difference. But even there, I would say experience isn't enough. There are very, very good adulterants, very, very good synthetics. And a lot of the adulteration that happens is not that somebody is just selling a synthetic. They will have a mix of some of the actual, natural attar or distilled attar, and then they will also adulterate with some synthetic. It is really hard to know. And I actually did also speak with somebody who works, around testing, to know, can you really test for all of these types of adulterants? And it's a lot more complicated than even I thought it would be. It's even hard to test for some of them. There are very sophisticated ways to adulterate. So there's no easy way to tell the difference, firstly. Secondly, why are they popular? Yes, definitely, partly it is cost. I mean, last year, so about a year ago, the gulab harvest in Hussain, it was a bad year. So the crop was, there was not enough flour, and the flour that came did not have enough oil. So very low yield. And some places selling it are selling 10 grams of that rue gulab for more than 30,000 rupees. I mean, not all, attars are this expensive, but some are. And so who is buying this? Of course, people are buying synthetics. And many synthetics actually smell very good. I have nothing against synthetics. For me, in the article that I wrote and in the research I do, I think it's more important that people should know what they're buying. In the same way that if you think about, handloom, muslin, or jamdani, or chicken curry, or anything, you want to know what you're buying. You are not always going to buy that handmade thing. Sometimes you will buy the machine-made thing, and that's fine. Same with synthetics. But I think people should know what they're buying. And I think if you want to patronize this art of natural distillation, then you should be able to do that, and you should be able to buy that. So for me, it's more about transparency and being informed and being able to make those choices. It's not either or. Yeah.
Ah, yeah, no, I completely agree. Especially reading this, because, like I said, I was in a way I've been reformed by reading this mark from my previous sort of simple, snooty ways. But points. And then there's artificial sandalwoods and artificial, and they're not seen as bad. They're just seen as, like you say, it's just like, well, I can't have the real thing all the time, but I quite, this is quite nice too. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
So we'll bring this conversation to an end right now in terms of our question and answer, but let's open it to the audience. I'm sure many of you have things to ask, and yeah.
We should.
Thank you very much. My gratitude to both of you and everyone here for this wonderful event, so thank you. Forgive my flat American accent. I'm a PhD student at UCLA, and I don't have any real knowledge of perfumes, but I study history of religion, comparative religion, religious cross-pollination, and when you're talking about this concept of exchange of smells, exchange of scents, and of course we're coming up on Easter. We're in the middle of Ramadan. We just had Holi. And so I'm curious if either of you have work that looks at the use of perfumes specifically in not just religious contexts, but mystical contexts, and also perhaps ways that maybe in the South and Southeast Asian context, these things have cross-pollinated between traditions, say the Sufi dimension of Islam, Bhakti within Hinduism, or even Buddhism or Christian mysticism. So any thoughts you might have on that would be very fascinating to hear. Thank you.
I guess, yeah, no, thank you. We should talk if you're in LA too. Yeah, I mean, in a way, I don't know where to begin with that. I mean, one thing that's striking is like when kind of puja rituals kind of start getting developed in India, is how simple, like now, what, the perfumes that are applied to the body of Lord Venkateshwara are not what probably anyone here is wearing. But, 1,000 years ago, they were the same. So you get this sort of rather interesting thing where religious perfumes, like frankincense and candles in churches, they get this sort of archaic vibe. Now, camphor is a very interesting case for that, but I'm not going to get into camphor. Camphor has a strange history like that. In terms of mysticism, I mean, I think I've been more involved with the material varieties. There's an interesting thing in terms of how you explain, how sort of karma sticks to you in some Buddhist circles. There's this idea of vasana, which is basically, I'm simplifying it again here, but basically, in the same way that those sesame seeds take the fragrance of the jasmine, and the jasmine is gone, but the quality of the jasmine, namely its odor, has entered the other thing, and then can be maybe put on my body. That is this sort of chain of, entity to entity to entity. That entity has disappeared, but something of it remains down the line. That is one of the ways they explain kind of karmic hangovers, sort of these samskaras that sort of stick to you, especially in Buddhism where there's no permanent ongoing thing to be marred by that. Mystical materials, I'd have to think. I'm sure there are. I tend to be I have this sort of general tendency just to be into sort of sacks of stuff, so tend to be a bit tangible kind of person, yeah.
Actually, I mean, the one thing I would say about that, so I don't look historically, I'm only looking at the contemporary context. And when I started my research, I'd heard a lot of people say to me, you know, that athars are used primarily by Muslims in India. This is a very, very common thing that people have said to me. And this is true, absolutely. And it is also used in religious contexts. You know, it is used at dargahs, it's used during Muharram here in Lucknow, I've seen it. It's used to attract the jinn in Feroz Shah Kotla if you go there on a Thursday night in Delhi. But it's also used in Hindu pujas, actually. So if you go to, there's a Krishna temple in Old Delhi where attar is applied to Krishna, but it is also given as prasad. You have, you know, the rugulab I mentioned, that is, you know, more than 30,000 rupees for 10 grams. Who is buying this? So one of these retailers in Delhi told me that the biggest population buying this rugulab, pure rugulab, are Khatu Shyam devotees who take it to Rajasthan and give it as an offering. So, I mean, that was interesting, I suppose, that this is not something that is only used in one community, this is used in many communities, and it's something I would definitely like to investigate more. Yeah, it's a big misconception.
And you know, another thing to add to this is that when I was reading this volume, it surprised me, but it shouldn't have surprised me actually, is that biggest users, consumers of it is the tobacco industry, and the large quantity of these things are not used for applying on our bodies, but actually go into tobacco. So,
and of course, people of all backgrounds use chewing tobacco.
That's right, yes.
Hello, James and Geeti. You met before?
So,
Can you hear me now?
थोड़ा करीब करके
Can you get me?
ऑन है
Hello? Yes. Specifically to James and Geeti, both of you probably can. I'm Pradeep from Kannauj. It's speaking about quite a bit. This is more to do to the, let's say, the distillation process that you've come across Kannauj. It's mostly hydrodistillation. Where did it originate from? We've been hearing, or I've been reading a lot, that it comes way back from the Harappan, Mohenjo-daro, terracotta set that's been found there, lying at the Takshila Museum. But I have my doubts about that. Anything, all these apparatuses that time were used mostly for alcohol distillation, not for fragrances. Fragrance distillation for fragrances came from the Middle East, more specifically from Persia. We don't have any recorded history of distillation in India of fragrances before the Muslim invasion. It comes only after that and starts more towards the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries when the Persians came in. I came across a lot of literature and photographs. There's a perfume theme park in Cyprus. You might be familiar with that. And they have the same apparatus there, dating back to Mesopotamia detail. So it's basically, and again it was alcohol, not flavor, fragrance. Fragrances in those days were mostly pastes in the form of maceration, enfleurage, garlands, but no distillation, no application of heat. Heat was, I mean, you could put all the ingredients in a pot or something, or the oil or something, would get the smell into it, but no distillation or collecting the essence of the fragrance or the compound. The two ancient fragrances, or let's say aromas, that can be identified way back in Indian treatises from the Bhagavad Gita. You have the sandalwood mentioned there in the 11th chapter, and then you have in the 3rd or 4th chapter you have the smell of the earth, the mitti earth. Practical. That's right. Apart from this, nothing else is mentioned, you know. So where would you find the, let's say, coming back to my original question, origin of hydrodistillation in India?
I said, actually, you know, what's
That-
really...
that's very, let's say, important for the other industry to know
Right.
where it comes from.
Yeah, it's a little bit out of my. I think you're right. It's later. The thing is the perfumery texts in Sanskrit I was dealing with, and there's the big ones that we've talked about. There's shorter ones that are earlier, and they give these lists of methods, and distillation isn't one of them. Yeah, like you said, there's these various other methods. You know, actually there is a Parker where you can sort of fill like a lemon with things and cook it, but it's not the same thing. It's cooking, you know what I mean? So yeah, so it does appear later. I think what we need there is people who work. I don't do languages like Persian and Urdu and things like that, so I'm not qualified to do that. But that is an answer we need. But it's interesting with the history of distillation. It's just one of it's complicated. It's very for some reason, and I don't know why, the history of distillation is like really controversial, and it's around the world. Many people want to be the sort of homeland of distillation. Just recently, you know, there's a whole thing about Mexico inventing alcoholic distillation that's just sprung to life, and people are making YouTube videos with these recreated, you know, like copies of ancient Mexican pots that can function as a still. So yeah, I mean, there's something odd about distillation that sort of attracts this controversy, and also a bit of a nationalist sort of, no, my country invented distillation first. And I don't know why distillation in particular seems to be such sort of magnet for this thing. I feel like you're the person to answer that, because it's a sort of modern historiographical obsession, you know what I mean? But yeah, that's my answer. I think you're right. I think you're completely right, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I also think you're right. I don't know when it exactly came in India, but you don't get references to distilled perfume, as you say, until medieval times. And I can't believe that you would have had distillation for 3,000 years. And, you know, only after that amount of time somebody would have distilled aromatics. It doesn't make sense. So I agree, it probably was much later, 12th century, 13th century, something like that. But actually, I don't know, and nobody really seems to know exactly.
Would the scale of the still answer part of that question?
Well, the thing is with archaeological finds. It's funny. I was just in Chhattisgarh looking at people making mahua liquor, and the thing is, the material you use for a simple still, everyone in their kitchen, an archaeologist could say they're a distiller. You know what I mean? Every single person here in their kitchen, I could go, you're a distiller. Actually, I could probably take a plant pot and that jar, that bowl and a plant pot and a bigger thing and that fire. Like you could. So it's tricky to track down distillation. You need things like residue analysis and things like that, and you know. I mean, it's easy to say, oh, well, archaeologists, go and do that now, but it's easier said than done if you know archaeologists to go off and do that. So,
I would argue that if it is common to have stills in every house, then it is probably obvious that all of them are not distilling.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, my point is that for basic distillation, the equipment is so simple that it's hard to know if it's just a colander or a sieve or a pot with a hole in it, you know what I mean? So it's like, well, is that really a still component, or is it just like something that everyone had, you know what I mean? So, tricky archaeological question, but very controversial, strangely.
See, the oil-based ethers from India, they are so, there's something mystical about it, magical about them. They last longer. As the legend goes, that, even if your apparel has gone through laundry a couple of times, some of it the perfume remains. All that is good. It's very earthy. There's the degree of rootedness, but yet these ethers account for less than 1% of the global perfumery market. Why is it so? Is it that the big-time entrepreneurs have not gone into it, or proper marketing has not happened? What do you attribute the reasons for such a poor market share, despite such intrinsic worth and value around it?
One of the things I would say to this is, so attar is an artisanal product. It is something that by definition it is slow, it is small scale, and it is variable. It's not automated, as you said, it's not automated, it's not measured, it is a very handmade process. And global perfumery requires consistency. It wants consistency. You know, if you're buying your Chanel No. 5, you want it to smell the same every time. So by nature, attar is difficult to use in a lot of these types of perfumes. That's one reason. But they are used, by the way. It's not that they're not used, but that is a very difficult challenge. There is also a challenge of gatekeepers, you know, and who decides what, you know, who regulates global perfumery and what is allowed to be used on the body. And it is fascinating. If you look at restricted items for perfumes, there are so many things that are others that are restricted. So it is actually very difficult to also get your product, you know, approved to be used in perfumery. And I honestly don't understand it myself, because it's almost like there are more restrictions on perfume materials than on food. You know, like you can list your allergens if you're selling a food product, but with perfume you just can't use it at all. It doesn't make sense to me. But it's a huge barrier, actually, the regulations. And in fact, you know, some of the big companies that are responsible for a lot of global perfumery, they are being investigated for operating like a cartel. You know, so I think that is also a big problem. And then I think, you know, the other thing is that attars, like the beauty of attar is something very different to the beauty of a commercial perfume, if you ask me. You know, this is oil-based attar, at least. You know, they unfold very differently. As you mentioned, you know, they, at the very beginning, they have a different purpose, they affect you differently, and so I think there is a huge opportunity here, and there are entrepreneurs who are taking it up. There are people who are using these ingredients to sell a different kind of perfume and to make a different kind of perfume with a different effect, you know. So I think you'll see that in the next few years there will be more and more businesses using attars and making them a star ingredient, not a hidden one, which they currently are in a lot of commercial perfumes, but an actual star ingredient. I think that will happen more.
One question from me. Hi. So in your introduction, we were told that you're going to launch a line of perfume very soon. All our best wishes for that. So in that, currently, my question is that what is a more prolific use for perfumes? Is it religious uses, like you mentioned, or erotic uses, as you mentioned, number one? And then second part of the question is, which are, they say, the top 5 most highest selling perfume, best known flavors, aromas of the world? I would be curious to know that.
Okay, so for your first question, can you repeat that one for me? What was the first one?
Religious and erotic.
Okay. So again, I specifically look at attars, so I cannot comment on all kinds of perfume, but I can say with attars specifically, no, they're not only used as a perfume or as a personal perfume. Yes, they are used for religious purposes. They're also still used for medicinal purposes. So attar mitti, which you just mentioned earlier, you know, this is basically, you have coolers like the ones that you're having your chai in, right? These cups are distilled over a base oil, often sandalwood. Well, now less often sandalwood, but previously sandalwood. So you have the smell of the wet earth after the first monsoon rain. And I asked one of the retailers, who is buying this? Why are they buying this? You know, who is your biggest buyer of attar mitti? And they actually said that primarily people are buying this as a cure for heat stroke, because Unani medicine practitioners and Ayurvedic medicine practitioners are prescribing it. So it's also used for medicine. It's used in food. As you say, the biggest use is actually tobacco. So it's being used in all kinds of ways. And the idea that it's a personal perfume, you know, I don't think that's actually the most common use of attar anymore, not the naturally distilled attars anyway. And the second question, the top 5 most popular perfumes, I have no idea. I absolutely have no idea. I mean, but you will see these, you know, interesting global trends. So there are certain perfumes that achieve cult status. You know, some years ago it was Santal 33, right? And recently, more recently, it's been Baccarat Rouge. And the interesting thing is, yeah, and you will, you know, this tells you about global perfumery and globalization and trends, right? So in the last year alone, if I walk down the street in Delhi, in London, in Sydney, I will smell Baccarat Rouge, no matter where I go. So you can see that consumption of perfume, there is some, you know, the global fragrance trade, I guess you can see it everywhere. So I mean, I can't tell you what the most popular perfumes are, but definitely you can sort of smell the same thing everywhere to some degree. And it changes, absolutely.
Hello, good evening. I'm Tayyaba, chef and researcher. And just as you shared about your temple discovery of the use of others, I was wondering if, barring your famous cultural centers like Delhi, Lucknow, Hyderabad, Bhopal, Kolkata to some extent, have you come across any other culinary traditions using Itra or Kevra and in a more prominent way? Are there any communities that both of you might have come across in your work?
So Kevra in food, yeah. To be honest, my fieldwork focused on Kannauj, Lucknow, Delhi, Hussain. So I can't honestly answer your question. I'm sorry, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if it is. I mean, and all Kevra really comes from Orissa. So maybe there is a tradition there, maybe somebody knows. I don't know, actually, I'm sorry.
Hello, I'm Aditi Chakrabarti. At the outset, I'd just like to say that it's been an absolute pleasure, James, to have heard you speak, a scholar of your stature, to have heard you speak all the way here in Lucknow. Thank you so much. And Geeti, of course, who shared her knowledge, her research, that was absolutely wonderful, and someone who brought it all together. So my question is to you, James. You did mention that in the past, in ancient India, people would wear the objects that had a fragrance, like a garland. And you even mentioned, I think, a block of camphor, is that right, on their forehead?
That's in Tirupati. That's the big iconic Venkateshwara white thing.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see.
That's camphor. I mean, there's loads of, you see the image, but it's camphor.
I see. So, the way I kind of knew camphor was that you lit camphor, when you do arti and, there's a fragrance that happens only when it is lit. But in this case, how would it be fragrant? The body temperature that gives it that fragrance? Or is it just...
Well, in a way, actually, I'll tell a mini story about camphor very briefly. So camphor appears, it was not there, it appears, and the earliest camphor is Borneo camphor from Borneo and Sumatra, only found, a bit like agar wood, it's only found naturally occurring in cracks in trees. It's not the distilled camphor, and that was the first camphor, and it was incredibly expensive. It was worth its weight in gold, and it appeared about maybe 3rd, 4th century, big deal. Maybe connected with palm chewing as well, hard to know. But at that point, it was so prestigious. It was like the poshest perfume you could imagine. Then you get distilled camphor sort of shortly after that, but still, camphor was pretty fancy. And so when people would endow, people were offering lamps. It was one of the things that was part of puja. It was and people would endow, say, a temple. They'd be like, oh, I give the income from these 4 rice fields or half the income to pay for a daily lamp for this god. And you start getting inscriptions where people are endowing camphor lamps, which would be a very posh, at that point, incredibly posh. So camphor sort of becomes it's like, you get these hierarchies, you have the lamps that you can give to gods, you can give ghee, you can give camphor's the best, but ghee is really good, and you cannot use animal fat and things like that. You get these kind of classifications of lamps, and camphor's the best. It was very posh then. So fast forward a long, long, long time, in the 20th century, 19th century, they're sort of looking for substitutes for ivory and horn, and they're like, oh, let's try and make substitute ivory and horn, and they come out with, they invent plastic. And so they invent sort of celluloid, basically. And the first plastic celluloid was very brittle and weren't very good, and they discovered that if you added camphor to the proto-celluloid, it made celluloid, in fact, which was kind of a good plastic. And then photography comes along, and celluloid just becomes huge. But at that point, everyone's relying on natural camphor, and there's actually the Japanese basically have a monopoly on Taiwanese camphor. And even when they synthesize camphor in Germany, the Japanese have these huge warehouses of Taiwanese camphor that they flood the market to put the German factories out of business. And so the Japanese have this stranglehold on camphor, and it's all celluloid. It's all celluloid driven. So there's this whole huge push. There's we need camphor. We can't be depending on the Japanese. So basically, it's the big New Jersey American chemical company. They get a really good camphor synthesis method. Can't remember. It's one of these huge companies. And so basically synthetic camphor suddenly becomes huge. And so then camphor's like the cheapest thing ever. And everyone's burning loads and loads and loads of camphor in temples, to the extent you may have heard about this, that a lot of temples have banned camphor because there's just so much camphor being burned. So it went from being like the poshest, rarest thing via photography and celluloid to being the cheapest thing ever and banned. But the camphor they use in Tirupati, that's like, you know, high quality Pachakapura Borneo camphor, which is the kind of one you can put in pan and stuff. And that's a kind of throwback to this ancient precious camphor, as opposed to the cheapo camphor in a plastic box that, yeah, you might have seen. So mini history of camphor, but it sort of shows all the different pressures of trade and innovation and technology that come into all these aromatics, in fact.
James, there was you know, you had this question on cuisine and flavors and aromas, and it just struck me that, you know, we take for granted that all the you know, all the European puddings and cakes we make, we put vanilla, right? And I think that's the predominant flavor in European Western cuisine, vanillin, which is not so in our traditional cuisine, right? So vanilla is an alien food aroma for us, but we use it so often now because we, you know, our cuisine has changed. But traditional aromas here is keoda, right? Keoda, saffron, that's our aroma. So I'm sure different kinds of foods and places have had their own prominent aromas in cuisine. There was another question. I think we'll take a last question now, and then we can have a conversation later. Yes.
Thank you all for this fascinating conversation. My question is you've mentioned some instances of medicinal uses in Indian perfume, and my question is, can you talk about perhaps were any of these used to repel insects, mosquitoes particularly? I know there's quite a lot flying around in this courtyard right now, but if you would expound upon that.
I don't know historically. I haven't really looked at the historical context for this, whether things were used to repel mosquitoes. Yeah, I don't know in India actually, specifically. I mean, we all, you know, a lot of people use citronella today, but I don't know if that was historically the case in India. Do you know? I don't.
I don't know. I'm trying to think now. I can't think. Actually, talking of repelling things, though, there are these sort of nasty incenses that you use for when you have like very ill babies possessed by sort of demons that sort of cause disease, and you sort of get all this stuff like, you know, crows' toenails and, you know, just nasty stuff. And you burn these. There's these various sort of nasty fumigations, and they drive away these demonic beings that are causing the disease. So it must have been a bit traumatic to be an ill baby floating in a cloud of crows' toenails and things. But so there is an idea that they repel, though. There is an idea that they repel. Yeah.
Civil.
Last word. Very, very rapid. This question of repelling insects, how are we comfortable with the idea that aesthetics in insects and humans are convergent evolution? We love plants, so it's great. We love their color, so today. We love the smell, but it's made for the pollinator, not for us.
That's true. The smell was never for us. It was for the pollinator. So it's the insect that's, you know, that's how evolution's worked here. So thank you very much, everybody. I mean, there are many things that we can talk about. Being in Lucknow, there's a culture associated with perfumery, with itra. In our childhoods, you know, we've seen these itardanis and, you know, the husky tattis and all these things that are now, you know, just things to remember, you know, and we don't see them anymore. But yes, this whole conversation has brought back so much, and there's so much that we've learned, and I think now we'll think about, you know, when we go to itra shops and buy itra as well. Thank you so much, James and Geeti, and Almitra, you've come all the way from Bombay for this program, and to Marg, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to thank all of you once again on behalf of Lucknow Bioscope for coming out here and making this a memorable evening for all of us. Just wanted to share a little story. I was already obsessing over what is in Chandayan last month when I received this email And one thing led to the other, and finally we are here. So thank you once again, James, Giti, Saman ma'am, for holding it all together. Once again, thank you. There are book copies behind the stage, behind there. You can have them, and there's some tea and snacks over there. Thank you.
ठीक है बंद कर दो बंद कर दो